Hello and welcome to the very first edition of Architecture for Kids podcast. I'm your host, António Capelão. I'm a trained architect, an architectural educator and founding director of award-winning Architecture for Kids CIC. In this podcast, I'm going to talk to practitioners and creatives that share the same passion as I do, to inspire and to engage children and young people to shape their built environment and the creative industries. The podcast is brought to you in collaboration with the Built Environment Trust, the Thornton Education Trust, and the Welsh School of Architecture, Cardiff University. My guest today is Jerry Tate. Jerry founded Tate+Co in 2007 and maintains a central role at the practice. He is driven by his desire to generate creative, pragmatic and unique solutions for each project that have a positive impact on our built and natural environment. Jerry is influential across all projects, ensuring design quality is paramount. He was educated at Nottingham University and at the Bartlett, where he received the Antoine Pennod Design Award, subsequently completing a master's degree at Harvard University, where he received the Kevin V. Kieran Prize. Prior to establish Tate+Co, he worked at Grimshaw Architects, where he led a number of significant projects, including the core education facilities at the Eden Project in Cornwall. Jerry is an active member of the construction industry community and is a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts. He is frequently invited to lecture, notably at Education Estates, the Carpenters Fellowship and EcoBuild, as well as to contribute to architecture publications, including the Architects Journal, Building Design, Sustain, and World Architecture News. He has taught at Harvard University, run a timber design and make course for the Dartmoor Arts Organization, and was a Rainier visiting professor for Kansas State University Architecture School in 2021 to 2022. Currently he teaches at the Bartlett School of Architecture, and in his spare time he is involved with a number of charities and is a trustee at the Grimshaw Foundation as well as a governor at Cranleigh School. Jerry, thank you very much for coming to talk to me today, and I'm looking forward to hear more about the work you do.
Hello, Antonio. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Jerry, one of the questions that I ask to all my guests is what was your favourite subject at school and what were you good at?
When I was at school, the kind of breadth of subjects wasn't really available. You know, like it was kind of like maths and English and then French, history. And the only two outlets which kind of really floated my boat were technical drawing and art, both of which I did up to kind of A level. And actually, I really enjoyed art. I was really good at technical drawing. I really enjoyed the precision of that as well. But neither subject kind of fully worked for me. So it's quite interesting that I went into architecture, because in lots of ways, that architecture is kind of bridge between, the kind of slightly more fluid approach of art and the precision of technical drawing.
Did it influence your career?
I think it did, but I grew up in... one of the reasons why I guess I'm really into trying to involve children with learning about architecture at an earlier stage is I grew up in a place called Suffolk, which is quite a rural county, and when I was growing up there was no motorways and no university. It was very sort of on its own, and I thought I probably wanted to be an architect. It kind of looked like the thing which might be representative of the subjects I enjoyed, and I quite like buildings. But there weren't a lot of examples of architects and architecture for me to look at. And the only two things I found in Suffolk were the Willis Faber building by Foster was in Ipswich where I was growing up. So I remember going to that as a child and being like blown away by, oh my God, buildings don't have to all look the same, they can be like this. And then there was an architecture practice called Mullins and Dowse in Woodbridge who gave me a lot of work experience, which I kind of really enjoyed. But the truth is there wasn't a lot in Suffolk really to inspire you to want to do architecture, and it's only really when I left Suffolk that I really found out what architecture was.
Do you have already a definition of what is an architect?
architects have a potentially very large role within the building industry. Not just drawing buildings, but also enabling development. So at the front end, you see architects now joining councils, kind of getting things to happen, or becoming developers, or becoming enabling planners. They also have a role with consultation, bringing communities in and help them learning. They have a role with post-occupancy, checking if buildings are working, and then subsequently retrofit. The broad scope of what architects probably should be doing, actually, is much, much larger than just drawing buildings. And I wish I'd sort of known that earlier, actually, to be honest with you. And I think that's a message that most of the workshops that I've been involved with are trying to give over to people, that, it's not just a single aspect of the profession that's important here. There's lots of different ways to do it, if that makes sense.
Yes, I mean there's a political, social, economic, and
absolutely.
Probably that's a lot of something that you kind of can experiment with your teaching at the Bartlett.
I mean, I have done a lot of teaching over the years. I do really enjoy it, and one of the things that I particularly enjoy about teaching, actually, is you are setting up a platform to allow people to explore their own ideas. It's not a vehicle for your ideas. And that's absolutely crystal clear in teaching. In practice, that is actually true as well, interestingly. So if you're running an architecture practice, your job isn't to do the big pen designs and someone else takes it on from you, because that produces bad buildings. So, actually, your job as a practitioner is also to set up a platform to create great architecture. But as a student, that is crystal clear as the deal. And I really enjoy that. That idea of assisting someone kind of working through a process. The trouble, I think, with university level stuff, which are sort of the thing I really enjoyed at Dartmoor, was getting this kind of group idea of everyone working together and getting this kind of collaborative co-creation idea together. So at Dartmoor, we'd have one project, 12 students, and that was kind of super interesting. And I've done that a bit at the Bart. That actually is part of the MEng course, and I think that's a good discipline for them as well. This idea of a co-creative base on which they're doing is something most people aren't very used to, I think.
I talked about Tate+Co. So how did that come about?
Yeah, I sort of pretty quickly knew that I wanted to set up an architecture practice. Not really because it's like you want to be the Charlie Big Bananas or anything, but it's just interesting for exactly the reasons I've just described. Actually, I think it's really interesting to set up a platform which has a certain attitude and then see what the outcome is in terms of the built outcome. Honestly, that's a really interesting experiment. So that's really what Tate+Co is about. We have quite clear ideas about the impact of what we do on the environment. So that's things like whole life carbon and stuff like that. And we've had that from the very start. But also we've got an opinion that connecting people to nature improves health and well-being and their living outcomes and all that kind of thing. So, and not just nature in a kind of like putting trees on buildings, but natural daylight and natural ventilation, views to the outside, lots of different aspects of it. So we've got a kind of philosophy, if you like, behind the platform, which we design from. And that's sort of like, well, what does that mean in terms of a building? I think that's really interesting. We just finished a big building for York St John University, and who was showing QPM around the other day. And, he said, gosh, it looks a bit quirky, it looks a bit different. I'm like, well, it's interesting, isn't it? I think that's what you get when we come from kind of like, it's a passive house rated building made of natural materials, so it looks quite chunky, it's got views to the outside, so there is glazing, but there's even daylight. There's lots of sort of parts of the philosophy which have a huge impact on how the building kind of comes about, if that makes sense. So that's the interesting experiment, right? You set up a platform, see how it goes. So I always knew I wanted to do that. I work for Grimshaw Architects. I think they're brilliant, have to say. If I hadn't set up my own practice, I'd still be there, for sure. They are fantastic. And also I'm a trustee now of the Grimshaw Foundation as well, so, I'm still involved, kind of arm's length with bits and bobs. There was a building called the Core, which is the education facilities building for the Eden project, and I was working with Jolien Brewis on it. So, we designed it, ran the project all the way through. I was a project architect and completed it. And at the end of that, I thought, well, I've learned, unless I move up the ranks now in Grimshaw, I've kind of learned what I need to learn here. So at that point, I stopped. and said, I think I need to go and do something else. And I actually went and did a master's at Harvard after that to give myself an intellectual reset, if you like. So I didn't really want to, there's a risk that, because you're standing in someone else's intellectual framework when you're in someone else's company, if you just stop and start your own company, you'll never establish your own framework, really. You'll always be spinning off of theirs. So I went to Harvard to do a 2-year master's to get a kind of intellectual reset, if you like. Came back and luckily had one project, which was a new build house for a friend. And it kind of went from there.
And then your engagement with children and young people, how did that come about?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So we are involved with children and young people in quite a few different ways, I guess. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to talk about how all of those came about. But, you know, we design schools, basically. And when you design schools, you know, a big part of your stakeholder community is children who need to be engaged with. So there's that aspect of kind of working with young people. We work, you know, because of, you know, I'm really keen for young people to know more about architecture and the built environment.
And why?
Well, because I think it's completely ignored at school level, to be completely honest. You know, I don't think there is any teaching about that at school level. So it's one of those things where if you're thinking about getting into it, it's very hard to know where to start, really. So unless you've got a relative who's doing it, it's a bit of a black box. And also what all the roles are, so not just architecture, but, you know, there's some really important roles: sustainability, MEP, structural engineer, you know, planner. All these roles that are kind of like not taught at school. Nobody knows what they are, and yet they have this kind of huge influence on our life. So we, from the start, really were working with Open City on their schools programme. So we knew Victoria Thornton, and she knew we were very passionate about this. So we started really doing children's workshops with Open City, going into schools and running schemes of work inside art classes, basically. And art seemed to be the best fit. And how would that work? What would you do? So there'd be so interesting. The other aspect of this is my wife is an art teacher, so I've got quite a good idea of what art teachers have to do. But it would essentially be we would come in and do, I think it was like 2 or 3 in-school workshops and one kind of visit to a building or one outside workshop, and they would be running a scheme of work which is about a term-long scheme of work, if you like. So there's other lessons that are built around it. And we would have essentially a programme which was a plug-in to a scheme of work that a teacher could run. And Open City ran all this really well. I think it was kind of the start of this idea of we've got to get people in schools understanding what architecture is. And actually at that point we were kind of really ambitious. There was talk of it maybe becoming a GCSE subject or something like that, which didn't really happen, and the world hasn't really gone that way. Actually, I think the world is kind of, you know, current education policies, if anything, shrinking the number of GCSEs available and having more of a kind of core of maths and English.
At Tate+Co, what are you doing? Some mentoring?
We work on a mentoring programme as well, so we're part of that. That's really good. We do the Delivery Schools Link, which is a sort of outreach programme working with the Architects Livery, looking at East End schools. So the City of London, which is where they're based, has quite an interesting social mix, you could say, just on the outside. So we interface a lot with that. We still work a bit with the ROBA and, you know, on their education programme, and we do a lot of kind of informal children's workshops. And I'm also, of course, heavily involved with the Grimshaw Foundation, and we are running our own children's workshops with urban learners. So I think actually now the majority of my time kind of doing the outreach stuff to children is expended on the Grimshaw Foundation.
Children and young people that you work with, how do they get to you, or, you know, and what sort of are they Londoners, are they from outside? So what's the demographics, and, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I'm going to give you quite a complicated answer. I'm really sorry, because actually you've kind of nailed something quite important. I remember we used to do a lot of RBA education programme work, and the difficulty with RBA is they're always kids of architects, of course, right? Because you have to apply to do this course, and so the architects are the ones who know about the RBA. And the reason I like things like the Delivery Schools link is there's an event that we do, a sort of festival fair, where we're one of many professions, and a whole host of schools come through over a 2 to 3 day period, and it's like a stall where we run an event and a workshop there. We run these sort of hour-long kids workshops where they can join in. And that way you're kind of harvesting a much wider cross-section of the population, but not geographically. Like, they're still all very close to London. And one of the things at the Grimshaw Foundation we've been talking about is exactly that question, like, how do people get to us? How do they join the programme? And inevitably, the risk is you end up being quite London-centric. And I think that, again, if people are doing work experience with us, might put them on the spot a little bit, but, the work experience people, I think this year we've got 4 or 5 people coming in to do work experience with us, but they're all children of friends, actually. And I feel a little bit guilty about that. I mean, I like having, obviously, because of what we do, I think it's really important people come in and do work experience with us, and we get them doing lots of things in the office, and I think it's really good for them and really interesting.
And also, how do they contribute to the office in this work experience?
The honest truth is they rarely make anything or do anything that's of kind of commercial value, right?
Yes.
So that's not the point of the exercise. I think that the point of the exercise is to allow people to meaningfully understand what the profession is, for them to make an informed decision about whether it's right for them or not. And I think if every architecture practice did that, there'd be a much better understanding of the profession by people who enter it, if you like, and there'd be much less surprise. You're like, oh my God, this is what architecture is. But, so then the final thing about something like the Grimshaw Foundation is one of the key things that we are now looking at is diversity, in terms of, if you like, our mission is to improve, the Grimshaw Foundation is to improve access to architecture and the creative industries, but now that has a real focus on diversity, and that is diversity both from looking to get people from the global majority, ethnic minorities, to come in, but also geographically. Like if you're in Lincolnshire and you want to become an architect, I'm not being horrible about Lincolnshire, but there's less architects in Lincolnshire than there are in Hackney, basically. It's much easier to learn about architecture if you're living in Hackney than it is in Lincolnshire. And how can we address that? And the reason that's important is you want your profession to be representative of a very wide cross-section of society, because otherwise it's solving a problem for a very narrow bunch of people. It's like that tech problem, isn't it? If all tech's invented by white males in their late 30s, then it just, most of the problems getting solved are those problems of white males in their 30s, right? And if all architecture is getting designed by, people like me, I'm 48 and I'm a white bloke, right? If I was the only type of architect out there, everything would be kind of steered around white blokes and age 48. In the end, the long-term solution to that is for the profession to be representative of the population it serves.
But you talked about something really interesting, geographically, how we expanded this programme.
There are methods of outreach now that weren't available 20, 30 years ago, and of course that's down to the internet and social media, right? So at the Grimshaw Foundation there is a lot of effort put into creating online resources and online schemes of work, and things like films and videos that people can kind of, short films that tell you a lot quickly that people can watch. I think that's really important. And there's a big social media outreach push, and I think that inevitably, is the way you can reach people in more remote locations. And the difficulty with the physical stuff is like, running a physical workshop can only happen in one location, and inevitably that'll, the locations of those are probably going to be in the centres of architecture, so the ones you just mentioned, like Manchester or London or Birmingham. But at least if people are signposted to where things are happening, then they understand more about what's going on before they just kind of rock up.
How easy it is to establish the relationship with the schools to create this project?
Again, the best fit for any of these things is inevitably the art department. So really it's contacting the art department in each school to understand if they have kind of capacity or they want to be involved with something like this. And actually, one of the problems with teaching really is what, when we started doing this, I guess about 15 years ago now, teachers basically had more capacity to do things like external partnerships. It was sort of less data heavy as a profession. There was less administration, and it didn't have to fit such a kind of narrow bandwidth. Now it's quite, I say, very heavily structured actually as a profession, teaching. And I'm not sure I could get into whether that's right or wrong. I don't really know. I don't know enough about pedagogy to be able to kind of deal with that. But I do know that leaves less space for external partnerships. So not every school that you approach is keen to have things like children's workshops with external partners. Not because they don't want to do it, but because they just don't have kind of capacity to be able to do it. As someone who obviously mainly likes to do art and technical drawing at schools, I am. I think that there could be a better understanding in education policy about the power of the creative industries in the UK. Even if you're a kind of a hard-nosed capitalist, churning out people who could draw really well and come up with good ideas and just think things through and make them happen. Yep. I think it's something like 2 billion people work for the creative industries, and it's the second biggest industry if you bracket them all together, and going from fashion to architecture. And they all started off as people who were good at art.
What is the impact of this work to them in your experience?
I think the impact, it's interesting with kids because the honest truth is it's hard to read the impact because kids don't have the kind of, the wherewithal's not the right word, they haven't got the life experience yet to understand, quite what things mean when it's happening to them. So you can see when a kid's really engaged, and that's really nice. So you often find that about half the kids are just kind of like really concentrated on it and really engaged, and that's lovely to see. It's like they're really getting into it and they're really going for it. And sometimes when it's more of a kind of self-selecting group, if you're running a workshop where people have applied to come, it can be up to 100%. So that's your best measure of are they into this, because they're just really engaged with it, they're really concentrated, you can see they're doing it. But you can't expect kids to turn around to you and go, "Thank you for that life-changing event. That really made me think about architecture." They're just not, they're not set up to think all that through yet because that's just not how they are.
There's often one or two that wants to become an architect after one of those workshops.
Yeah. That's true. And that is satisfying. I want everyone who becomes an architect to know what architecture is before they make that jump, because if you don't love it, it's hopeless. As a profession, you've got to really like it. Architecture is a really, really inspiring thing to do. It is a fantastic thing to do. But it's also,
and the training in itself, it's amazing.
The training is amazing, but it is. If anyone, it is a hard job, right? It is a hard job being an architect. It's hard because there's a lot to deal with. Both in terms of managing lots of things. There's a very wide aspect to it. The hours are quite long. You've got a lot of responsibility, like legally, actually, interestingly, which is all right, and that's all good, and that's fine if you are really into it and really want to do it. Then you'll just find all of that. You'll just do it. So people who come in, they've got to understand that equation, I guess.
You said earlier that you've been doing outreach work for the last 15 years. Yeah. How has this landscape has changed within the time that you've been working?
Yeah, interestingly, actually, this is a strange answer. I don't think it's changed as much as I would have liked. I have to be honest. I think actually the methods of outreach have really improved, and I think the people doing it have massively refined what they're doing. The stuff that people are achieving with outreach and with workshops, I think, is amazing. But the kind of scope of what it's achieved in terms of integrating itself into schools, I think has been less than we all hoped for at the start, 15 years ago. So that's a kind of mean thing to say, and it's not the fault of anyone doing these workshops either. But just I think the appetite of schools to kind of fold these outside players in has reduced over the years. I think the appetite amongst architects to go into schools for no money and run workshops is huge, right? That is a massive and frankly untapped resource, actually. Understanding of the value of creativity in schools, which isn't there at the moment. And I think it can be balanced by the academic stuff. I'm certainly not dismissing, right, that you should be doing the academic work, but I think that there's the balance has tipped too far in terms of that kind of straight academic stuff, when I suspect that certainly the UK's kind of strength, if you like, on the world stage has nothing to do necessarily with straight academia. I mean, of course it does, and you could say life sciences and all that, but when you think about things that we do which have this kind of huge soft power impact, like the music industry, the film industry, architecture. London is an architecture centre, right? There's a few in the world. I mean, it just is. It's an international architecture. There's London, there's New York, maybe Tokyo, Hong Kong, probably Berlin is a growing one.
Yeah, Melbourne,
and possibly Copenhagen, right? But that's it. London is like front and centre, one of the biggest architecture centres. So it's this sort of industry that we've got, which has come from an international base, actually, but the core of a lot of it is from people who were at a school in the UK who are good at art, right? Yeah. That's what a lot of architects are.
We forgot Chicago.
Oh, Chicago. Oh.
Is there any other challenges that you want to talk about?
I mean, the other challenge is, architects are time poor, and I think this is a problem actually across the teaching profession, interestingly, but there's kind of the invention of schemes of work, if you like. So I think we've now got, not to sound like we're lazy, but we've got like 6 different kind of playbooks for how to run workshops, that we kind of know this is a kind of thing where we make a model, this is the thing we do a collage, we've got these kind of things, so we kind of know how they go. We've got resources in the office and like plastic boxes and things, but it's taken us a while to get to the point we've got that stuff all lined up, and we're not getting paid to do it, do you know what I mean? So there's sort of zero time from a commercial point of view to prepare it all. And I think that something that's quite interesting is to kind of prepare those resources for people to be able to kind of like download them, a list of what you should be taking to a workshop. You need these pens, this type of safety scissors, these bits of sticky tape. Just that kind of like basic level of a scheme of work prep, if you like, would be really handy for architects, because all architects are time poor.
I have one last question,
yeah,
which is there a question I should have asked you that I haven't asked you? And what is that question?
There is a question that we sort of question this, which is, what is the, you run an architecture practice, which is a business, what is the business outcome from all this outreach work, right? And I think the reason you should have asked that is because there's like a suspicion of why are you doing this thing, sort of thing, And honestly, it makes no commercial sense at all. Like, I have a very kind FD, Caroline, who essentially sets aside money for us to go and do stuff like this because we think we should do it. So it makes no business sense. It does make sense for the profession, I have to say. It makes sense for the long-term health of the profession. So in a funny kind of way, I think that we are doing it, and I think it'd be great if all architects did it, and it's like an investment for the profession in 20, 30 years' time. In the end, really, that's the benefit of it. So, I might be too old and doddery to even see the benefit, if that makes sense. But if everyone did it, and if everyone did outreach into schools, it'd be an incredible profession in 20, 30 years' time. But I think from a direct here and now business point of view, if you're running an architecture practice, that it's quite hard to justify, actually. So there's a sort of conflict there, which is interesting. Great. Thank you, Antonio, and thank you for having me. Great. Awesome.
Thank you very much to my guest today, to all the listeners, and please subscribe to Architecture for Kids podcast and leave your rating and a review. Recommend us to your friends and family, and to find out more about it, visit our websites, antoniocaplan-portfolio.co.uk, buildingcentre.co.uk, thorntoneducationtrust.org, cardiff.ac.uk, and follow us on Instagram, Arch for Kids CIC, Twitter, @Kaplan, LinkedIn, @Kaplan, CAPELAO, and please join me again next week for another episode of Architecture for Kids podcast, brought to you in collaboration with the Built Environment Trust, the Thornton Education Trust, and the Welsh School of Architecture, Cardiff University.